All right, so I'm sorry I couldn't be here today, but I didn't want to get you guys behind on content. So I went ahead and recorded the slideshow and some of the notes that you need to have. But please make sure that if you have any questions, you jot them down so that you remember to ask me on Tuesday when we meet again. And I will try to go over whatever misconceptions or whatever you have, since I'm not there for you to ask me questions. Don't feel like you can't ask me questions. You'll just have to kind of hold on to them until we're here next time. Um, Section 1 is over kind of the basics of the Constitution and what's in them, how it's set up. The first thing is the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and we find that in what's known as the Supremacy Clause, which is in Article 6 of the Constitution. And it basically says that nothing can trump the Constitution. No, state laws can't go above it. Federal laws can't go above it. Everything has to make sure it agrees with the Constitution. It is the fundamental law. But we have our basic principles of government in the United States in the Constitution, the limits within which the government must conduct itself, and also the basic rules of American politics and how the government is going to be set up from here on out. The Constitution has three different parts. It starts out with the preamble, which is kind of an introduction. There's not a whole lot of law in the preamble. It's just our basic ideas of government. And it starts out with "we the people," which automatically gives you this idea of popular sovereignty and that the power of the government comes from the people. And then we break it into the 7 articles. And this is what you guys did your posters on. And these are the basic structures of government and what is in the original Constitution. To that, we have added 27 amendments, the first 10 being the Bill of Rights, the next 17 being ones that we have added over time. And this is one thing that's been able to leave the Constitution a more malleable document, is the ability to add and take away from it as we go. But you will find that it is not incredibly detailed in its content. It is vague at times to be, vague, and sometimes it's vague because they set it up later. The first 3 articles all deal with the 3 branches of government. It's the basic organization of each branch and how people are chosen to office. Article 1 is by far the biggest, and it is over Congress. They automatically wanted Congress to be the most important, have the most power of the 3 branches. Then you have the executive branch and the president, the judicial branch. As long as you can remember which order that they go in, this should be really easy to remember because it's the 3 branches of government. Article 4 is the relationship with the states, and in some cases the relationships that the states have with each other. For example, the fact that a criminal can't commit a crime in Kentucky, flee to Tennessee, and then just hide out in Tennessee. If Tennessee finds them, Tennessee has to extradite them back to Kentucky. Article 5 is going to be the amendment process, and we'll go through that here in a minute, but it's how the Constitution is able to be changed. Article 6 is where you're going to find that supremacy clause, that the Constitution is supreme law. Then Article 7, if you were lucky enough to get this poster, is probably the easiest because it's just the ratification process when the Constitution comes into effect, and then they all sign it and all that good stuff in Article 7. So Article 1, if you guys want to go ahead and star this is going to be one of your topics for one of your essays. And it's essentially this idea that we created a bicameral government. And this is going to be a change because in the Articles of Confederation, we had a unicameral government with only one house. And we're going to change that to a bicameral legislature with 2 houses for 3 reasons. And it's essentially going to ask you to give me those 3 reasons and explain them. The first one is going to be historical reasons. And this is the fact that Parliament had 2 houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The fact that most colonial assemblies are going to be bicameral. And then when those assemblies create their constitutions, most of those constitutions are also going to have bicameral governments. So historically, it's what we're used to. It's what we have always kind of had. And so we have this idea of a bicameral legislature. To this day, with the 50 states, all but one are going to have bicameral legislatures, and that one is going to be Nebraska, which is going to have the holdout of a legislature. The second reason is practical reasons, and this is the fact that they had been fighting over the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan, and the biggest fight in those difference of the plans is going to be, are we going to have equal representation or are we going to have representation by population? And so this is going to give us our solution of having a house that has both. So you're going to have the Senate, which has equal population, and then you're going to have the House, which has equal representation, and then you're going to have the House, which has equal, or not equal, you have population-based representation, so that it's going to be a compromise between those two plans. The third reason is going to be theoretical reasons, and this is going to be that we give the bulk of power in the government to the legislative branch. And so the framers were a little nervous that this branch might get too powerful. And so with that, they thought if they split it into two houses, that those houses can check one another. When we get to sort of each branch, we'll spend a chapter on each branch, and we're going to specifically get to how a bill becomes a law and sort of what that process is. But one key part of that process is that each house has to pass identical bills. The House has to pass a bill, the Senate has to pass a bill, and they have to be the exact same language. And so in this, it's kind of an extra step and an extra hoop that they have to jump through in order to pass legislation. And so in that way, they thought that it would kind of diffuse or dilute their power that they have so that it doesn't dominate the other branches. The negative side to this is it does take more time to get anything done, and it makes them much less efficient in what they are capable of doing because it has to go. Article 2 is going to be the executive branch, and this goes through who can be president and then what the presidential office is like. And the president is going to be the commander of the armed forces. They're going to be able to make treaties, approve or veto acts of Congress, call special sessions of Congress, send and receive diplomatic representatives, and essentially they have to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. What we're going to find when we get to the executive branch and go a little bit more into detail is that you're going to find that the president has a lot more foreign policy power than they do domestic policy power. But they still have a lot of power, and in that they have things that also have to be checked through the other branches. And we'll get to that when we start talking about checks and balances. It is a pretty loose outline of sort of what the president's job is, but it does give us some idea of what that executive is. Article 3 is a little different because Article 3 does set up the Supreme Court, but when it sets up the Supreme Court, it sets up the Supreme Court and then essentially says that Congress is going to set up the lower courts later. And so we know that there are going to be inferior courts. We know the jurisdiction of the federal court system. We just don't know exactly what that structure is going to be until Congress is going to set it up. One of the things that to note is that the federal government really doesn't hear as many court cases as the state does. If you're going to go to court, most likely you are going to end up in a state court. This is just through, the jurisdiction of the state courts. They take the bulk of the court cases that go into the nation. The other kind of court, we have what's known as the regular constitutional courts, which are the courts that you've heard of: the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, the District Court, the U.S. Court of International Trade. And then on top of that, you have what's known as special courts or legislative courts. And these do not have the broad judicial power of the United States, but they are created by Congress for some sort of special need. So the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, U.S. Tax Court, the Courts of District Columbia, courts that kind of come later that are created by Congress for whatever reason, are considered these legislative courts because they are created by the legislature and not by the Constitution. All right, so then we go into sort of the 6 basic principles of the Constitution. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time here because these are things that we've already gone over as far as kind of what our principles of government are. But the first is popular sovereignty. Again, we start the Constitution with the words "we the people," which gives us that the government is only by consent of the governed. The next is limited government. And this is not only that the government can only do what we say that they can do, but also that the government must obey the law. And there you get 2 definitions. The definition of constitutionalism, which is that government must be conducted according to the constitutional principles, and then the rule of law, which is the government and its officers are always subject to and never above the law. And these are, founding principles for government in our Constitution. Then you have the idea of separation of powers and checks and balances. And this is something that we have been learning forever. But the one thing I will note here is that please do not get these confused. Separation of powers is just that we split it up into the three branches, and those three branches each have their own job. Checks and balances is when we get into veto privileges and all that kind of stuff. And I'll show you a chart later that gives you all the different checks and balances that each branch has over the other branches. But typically what happens is I ask a question about separation of powers and people think it's too easy, and so they overthink it and start giving me checks and balances. And they are two distinct principles. Although they are related, they are not the same. So then we have the idea of judicial review. And oddly enough, judicial review is not actually in the Constitution. Most people think that it was intended, but the law or the words of judicial review are not in there. They are not established until Marbury versus Madison. Now, most of the time we don't pay attention to what Marbury versus Madison, like what the court case was about anymore. Just the fact you see it as it created judicial review, or it set the precedent for judicial review. And this is true. But essentially what happened with the election of Thomas Jefferson, while John Adams is walking out the door, he is kind of appointing people to certain positions. And one of these people is Marbury, and Marbury does not end up getting his position. And so as a full-blooded American, he sues for it. And in the court case, Marbury loses to Madison and does not get his job. The interesting thing about this is that John Marshall, who is Chief Justice at the time, the one making this decision, is a Federalist and a little bit more into sort of a more powerful central government. And Madison is one of our leading Democratic Republicans who, were strict constitutionalists, and they wanted to make sure that everything was directly written into the Constitution, especially, considering James Madison's view of the Constitution. And so when John Marshall makes this court case, he says that Madison wins the court case because he declares a law unconstitutional. And it's the first time that the Supreme Court ever does this, which is interesting because we kind of see it as the Supreme Court's job now. But it's not until Marbury versus Madison that this happens. And then John Marshall doesn't do it again for a while, hoping that kind of nobody makes a big stink about the fact that he just created this huge thing for the Supreme Court to be able to do. And it works. Madison is happy because he wins the court case, but on the long-term scheme of things, the Democratic Republicans probably wouldn't have liked what it created for the Supreme Court because it gives the Supreme Court a whole lot more power. But nowadays, we kind of look at it like somebody has to be the one to, kind of be the watchdog of the Constitution. Then we have the idea of federalism. This is that division of power among the central government. And in your notes it says ventral. Please change that. It's central with a C and not a V. And regional governments. Here, the regional governments are going to be the state governments. And that government power, should be divided among the two. All right, so Section 2, we have the amendment process and then some of the amendments that have been added to the Constitution. And so the Constitution provides for those amendments, and it's an easier process than what we had seen in the Articles, which required all of the states to agree to an amendment. But amendments are changes in the written word. They're just as legally binding as the original Constitution. The only difference is kind of where they're added versus the legality of it. But Article 5 is what has this amendment process. And you're going to see that there's two ways to propose amendments and also two ways to ratify amendments. The proposal is you have to have either 2/3 vote in each House of Congress to propose an amendment or a national convention to propose an amendment. The idea being they wanted some way for the states to propose an amendment to happen just in case that amendment was taking away powers from Congress. You never want the only sort of way Congress gets to take powers away to be in the hands of Congress, because that doesn't really make sense. But you're going to see that most of our amendments come from that vote in each House of Congress. Ratification. Please note that this is one of the only times in government that we see the numbers 3/4. Typically when we see government numbers, it's either simple majority or 2/3. Ratification takes 3/4, and you could do it two ways. Both come from the states. either 3/4 of state legislatures or 3/4 of state conventions have to ratify an amendment before it goes into the Constitution. This is going to show us that the founders automatically wanted to make sure that either nationally we propose them and then statewide we ratify them, and we have that federalism in place even in amending. A couple of things to note. One, the president has no official role in amendment process. He can't veto them. He doesn't sign them. It is done completely without them. The states cannot go back on their word. Essentially, once they approve it, it's done. The only thing that they can change is if they say no, they can go back later and approve it. You're going to see this with the 18th and 21st Amendments, which is prohibition. When we create the 18th Amendment, even though the 21st essentially says, okay, forget the 18th Amendment, we can't just strike the 18th Amendment from the Constitution. We just have to add a new amendment that says, we were just kidding. The one thing that you can do is you can place what's considered a reasonable time on the passage of amendments, which means that if we don't pass them in that set amount of time, then that amendment can be passed. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments, and there's a chart on page 93 that I want you to look at before the test because it gives you what some of those amendments are. But 1 through 9 are going to deal with civil rights and kind of give you what that is. A lot of them are going to deal with if you are accused of a crime or something like that, what your rights are there. A couple other notable amendments. The 12th Amendment is how we're going to elect the president after the election of 1800. Essentially what was happening is the original Constitution says that whoever gets first place is the president, whoever gets second place is the vice president. Well, once we had the creation of political parties, this doesn't work very well because you have the first place who wins and is president, and then the second place is typically the person who's in the opposite party who doesn't agree with that person trying to work with him and be the vice president. And this just, imagine today that would mean either Clinton or Trump would be the president, and then whoever doesn't win would be the vice president. That's not a very good working relationship to have. And so we change it to what we have now in the 12th Amendment. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are called our Civil War Amendments, and they are going to be amendments passed typically during Reconstruction that change how the Constitution views slavery. And if you can remember the 13th, 14th, and 15th, and you can remember what they are, you should be able to remember the order that they come in, because they kind of make sense. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, the 14th gives citizenship, the 15th gives voting rights. And it kind of makes sense that in order, to give citizenship, you have to abolish slavery, and make sure that they aren't slaves when they become citizens. And then in order to give voting rights, they have to be citizens first and then to be able to get voting rights. And so they go in order as sort of a step process. The 18th is prohibition. The 19th is the women's right to vote. And for some reason, we tend to forget this, that it happened so late in U.S. history, which was 1920. That women got the right to vote. So when we see the 15th Amendment, which says that race can't matter, gender still can at that point. The 21st Amendment is the repeal of prohibition. The easiest way to remember this is that you can't drink at 18, but you can at 21. The 22nd Amendment is that the president gets 2 terms. Before this, it had been just kind of understood because of tradition in George Washington. But FDR is actually our only president to serve more than 2 terms, and he goes into his 4th term before he dies. And then after FDR, we're going to go ahead and set it kind of in stone that the president can only get 2 terms. Now, FDR was elected to all 4 terms. It's not that we were mad at him for being president 4 times. It's just that, that's a long time to be U.S. president. The 26th Amendment is the voting age to 18. This was during Vietnam, and during Vietnam you could be drafted at 18. And so people were upset that they could be drafted yet couldn't vote. And so they lowered the voting age from 21 to 18 in the 26th Amendment. The 27th Amendment is that Congress can't raise their pay during that term. And this is originally written by James Madison with sort of the original Bill of Rights. It just wasn't passed. And so Congress controls their own salary, but if they give themselves too much of a pay raise, it'll be whoever essentially gets elected after them because they won't be reelected in their term, so they have to kind of be careful with giving them. So, other ways to change the Constitution, and to be clear, this does not change the wording of the Constitution. This just changes how we interpret the Constitution most of the time. But it's passage of basic legislation by Congress, actions taken by the President, key decisions by the Supreme Court, and activities of political parties or customs and usage. And so it doesn't change the wording, but sometimes how we see the Constitution. Basic legislation, laws to clarify brief provisions. The structure of the federal court system is passed in the Judiciary Act of 1789. Different offices of the executive branch. Congress, in many ways, has expanded the Constitution, what we consider interstate commerce, all that kind of stuff that comes through basic legislation. We get it from the original Constitution. It doesn't change the wording, but it does change the structure from it. Executive actions can come from executive agreements. They could come from treaties. Executive agreements, however, do not have to be approved by the Senate, but treaties do. But they are just typically as legally binding as treaties are that have to be approved. Court decisions. The Supreme Court is going to interpret and apply the Constitution. And the court is going to, again, establish their own power of judicial review. But you also see that, sometimes every once in a while they are going to go and negate a decision that they've already made. Plessy versus Ferguson is going to be our original separate but equal court case. And then you're going to see Brown versus Board of Education say that was wrong. Like, you can't have separate but equal. Separate is inherently unequal. According to Brown versus Board of Education, both dealing with the same Constitution, both dealing with the same topic, just in different time frames. And so the Supreme Court can also change the Constitution kind of multiple times on the same decision on how they interpret. Party practices, how we nominate presidents has changed over times. Party politics is now involved in almost every decision of how we do this. And then you also have your definition of the electorate. Custom and usage, the fact that we have a cabinet. Okay, this is not in the Constitution. This is set up originally by George Washington and has just kind of continued. The vice president getting the office of the presidency if something were to happen to the president. This was kind of understood, but not necessarily in there until the 25th Amendment and how that works. Senatorial courtesy, typically, this is how senators approve things that the president wants. And then again, the two-term president's tradition is set up by tradition, and then we add it to the Constitution later. But it wasn't until FDR that even needed to be added, because everybody just did it because it was tradition. All right, at this point, we have made it to section 3. This is the notes that you need to copy for homework. Please have these, and they are up on the website, so please have these copied by Tuesday. And again, sorry I couldn't be here, but I will see you next week.